Chapter 3. Chust for Pretty. "Togo!" Nancy cried fearfully as the terrier was thrown to the side of the street. The car that had struck the dog flashed past. Nancy ran to her pet, who was alternately whining pitifully and giving short yelps of pain. She was alarmed that he might have been mortally injured. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured tenderly, wondering what she might do to relieve the dog's suffering. Leaning over to pick him up, she noticed a long cut on the terrier's hip, but there were no other marks. Suddenly, Togo stood up and shook himself. Nancy's heart leaped with joy. Her beloved pet was going to be all right. Gently, she lifted the dog and carried him inside to the kitchen, where she bathed the cut with antiseptic. He nosed her hand gratefully, then started to lick the wound himself. Hannah, who had dashed down from the second floor, looked on in mingled dismay and bewilderment. Nancy explained what had happened. "That man in the car deliberately tried to kill Togo," she said angrily. "I was so worried about him I forgot to look at the license number on the car." "I'm sorry you didn't," Hannah replied vehemently, going into a tirade about hit-and-run drivers. "And I told you, Nancy," she reminded the girl, "that hex signs bring trouble. That man in the car hexed Togo for sure." Nancy tried to calm the excited housekeeper. "That is not possible," she said. "Oh, yes it is," Mrs. Gruen insisted. "It all ties in." Her reasoning was that the man in the car was the same one whom Nancy had surprised at the Follett mansion and reported to the police. "He's hexed you too. Put a spell on you." "But Hannah, that's wishing bad luck on someone, not causing it, as he did." The housekeeper declared that it made no difference how it happened. So long as Nancy worked on the case, the suspect would try to harm her. "I think you'd better give up the Lancaster trip." "Why, Hannah, I couldn't do that," Nancy protested. "And anyway, if he's here and I'm in Pennsylvania, I'll be safer," she teased. "Besides, I want a chance to practice my German." The woman was adamant. "Let the police catch the furniture thief," she said. "There's something queer about that witch tree symbol. I don't like it." Mr. Drew, who had been talking on the second-floor telephone, now came to join them. He was relieved to learn that Togo was all right. At once, Hannah told him about her worries concerning Nancy, but the lawyer did not share her point of view. "As to the hex business, we are intelligent people and don't believe in witchcraft. If Nancy is careful, I think it will be safe for her to make the trip." Later that evening, Nancy packed a suitcase and, before retiring, exchanged goodbyes with her father, since he was leaving early in the morning for an out-of-town case. Nancy promised to let him know of any progress she made and where she would be staying. After breakfast the next morning, Nancy took her car to a local service station for a checkup. When she returned home, Hannah Gruen met her at the door. In her hand was a special delivery letter which had come for Nancy. "I'm sure this means trouble," the housekeeper said gloomily. The letter had been mailed from Montville, a town about 20 miles from River Heights. Nancy quickly tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it was the strange hex symbol. The words witch tree symbol were missing, but underneath, printed in a bold hand, was the warning, "Stay home." "Now I hope you're convinced," said Hannah. "If you do go to Lancaster, you'll be taking your life in your hands." Instead of being worried, Nancy was more intrigued than ever at the prospect of making the trip. Montville was on the way to Lancaster. The furniture thief had already started for Pennsylvania Dutch country. To Hannah, the girl detective said, "I admit that the sender of this note is trying to scare me off the case. but he's not going to do it." Giving the woman a resounding kiss, Nancy added, "I'll be very, very careful. Please don't worry." "I can't promise that," the housekeeper answered. "I'll worry about you every minute until you're back safe and sound." She sighed. "But since you're determined to go, I'll hold good thoughts for you. Have a nice time, dear, and drive carefully." Nancy gathered up her suitcase, coat, and a lunch the housekeeper had packed and carried them to the blue convertible. After waving to Hannah and throwing her a kiss from the car window, she backed into the street and headed for Bess Marvin's home. Bess, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and pretty, though slightly overweight, stood on the porch waiting. She hurried down the walk, tossed her bag into the rear of the car, and climbed in beside Nancy. "Hello," she said. "Sounds like an exciting trip. I've been reading up on the Pennsylvania Dutch country. What a place to eat! Best food in the whole United States." Nancy laughed. Though Bess was sometimes less courageous than either Nancy or George when working on mysteries, she was never timid about trying new foods. She was a gay companion and loyal friend and could be depended upon for help in a real emergency. A few minutes later, they picked up George Fane, who wore a tailored white blouse and trim-looking brown gabardine skirt. Over her arm, George carried a matching jacket. The tomboyish girl, after putting her suitcase in the back, jumped into the front seat with a "Hi there!" and slammed the door. "It's a grand day, eh?" "I like August weather. It's good for sports. Not too hot and not too cold." Her cousin Bess sniffed and remarked that so far August had been too hot for comfort. Nancy laughingly warned the cousins not to start even friendly arguments so early in the morning. "I'd call this a perfect day to begin solving our mystery," she declared gaily. "Please tell us everything about it," Bess begged. "You were pretty vague on the phone. I hope that it's not too dangerous a one," she added. As they rode along, Nancy told the entire story. The two girls listened intently, knowing that if they were to be of assistance to Nancy, they would need to know all that had happened so far. Bess remarked that she did not like the hex symbol angle of the mystery. She was inclined to agree with Hannah Gruen that it might bring bad luck to Nancy. The young sleuth assured Bess that she did not believe in the superstition. "Nor in ghosts, zombies, or witchcraft," she said with a chuckle. "But," she continued, growing serious, "I understand there are some people in the back country of Pennsylvania who still think it's possible to hex people. Of course, most of the farmers just laugh at this nowadays." Several hours later, the girls reached the area where the first hex signs appeared on barns. They stopped to admire several, and even Bess had to admit that the various circular designs, using motifs of birds, stars, and crosses, were very colorful and attractive. Seeing a farmer coming from one of the larger red barns, Nancy stopped the car and asked him the design's true significance. Smiling, the burly man replied, "It's just for pretty." "And has nothing to do with any superstition?" Bess asked. The man shook his head. "No, just to make pretty the barn. But queer folks think it is for to chase witches. That is foolish, ain't?" The girls nodded and drove on. George smiled. "I could hardly figure out that man's quaint language. We may find ourselves having some trouble up here understanding what people say." "Yes," Nancy agreed. "And I think if we don't understand, we'd better ask." The girls rode for nearly an hour through the methodically planned, beautiful farm country, stopping only long enough to eat lunch. Everything looked spick and span. Fields of corn, potatoes, and tobacco were straight and green. weedless vegetable gardens of beets, carrots, and beans were surrounded by neat borders of flowers. Coxcomb, begonia, and geranium bloomed in profusion. "These are the finest-looking farms I've ever seen," Bess remarked presently. "What fun it would be to live on one!" Nancy said her father had told her of the various divisions of the Pennsylvania Dutch country. Around the Lancaster area were most of the plain people. "The owners of the farms there take great pride in their land," Nancy went on. "They attribute their abundant harvests to deep plowing, correct rotation of crops, fertilizer, and plenty of hard work." "Which section is Mr. Alpha Zinn's home in?" "Beyond Lancaster, in the part where the Amish live." "Amish?" Bess repeated. "Tell us about them." Nancy said that Mrs. Tenney had explained to her that there were two types of Amish: the church Amish, who were comparatively modern and owned automobiles and electrical appliances, and the house Amish, who are very strict and do not believe in using any of these fancy things. "They feel that hard work with the hands is much better for the health and the soul," Nancy concluded. After a while, she stopped and consulted a map. Then she said, "I think this is the side road that leads to Mr. Zinn's farmhouse. Mrs. Tenney gave me general directions." Nancy drove on, watching road signs carefully. Presently, she turned onto a bisecting road and drove a little faster. She had not gone more than a quarter of a mile when the car began to chug peculiarly and started to slow down. "That's funny," Nancy said, frowning, and the other girls looked worried too. They glanced quickly at the various dials on the dashboard. There was plenty of gas. The oil gauge was registering pressure, and the car was not heating up. "I wonder what is wrong," George remarked. "I don't know," said Nancy, "but the motor's not taking any gas." The engine suddenly died, and the car, after rolling a few feet, stopped. The three girls looked around in dismay. There was not a house in sight, and the next town where there was likely to be a garage was several miles away. Nancy got out, raised the hood of the car, and looked for loose or broken wires. She could find none and finally shook her head. "We're really stuck," she announced. End of chapter 3.